Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to all those that are joining us. Thank you to everybody for joining for what promises to be a very, very exciting evening. I'm particularly excited to be introducing this event, both because of the topic we'll be speaking about and the speaker that we'll be privileged to hear from. Mental health is always an important topic to talk about, but I think especially now in the current climate that we're facing with the coronavirus pandemic, with the lockdown, and all the stresses and the anxieties that it's brought together with it. And somewhat ironic that over the past few weeks and months, we've been speaking about pikuach nefesh. We've taken such drastic steps to protect our health, to maintain the safety and the physical well-being of ourselves and all those around us. And that in many cases, these steps have brought with them an enormous toll on our mental health, on our emotional and our psychological well-being. And thankfully, in recent years, awareness has definitely grown in this area. Recently, we just had Mental Health Awareness Week. And I think today we all realize that looking after our mental well-being is just as important, if not more important, than protecting our physical health as well. We definitely see this idea in Torah. We see it in Halakha as well. And I'm sure we'll hear more from that this evening in terms of the Torah approach to maintaining our mental health, particularly through these trying times. And I can think of no one better to give this talk than our speaker tonight, Rabbi Dr. Sytner. Rabbi Dr. Sytner was the scholar in residence recently in February at the RCUS conference. And I can tell you that it's not an easy task to get up and speak in front of a group of rabbis, to do it not just once, but about 5 times throughout the conference. And I probably speak for everybody when I say that at the end of the conference, after we heard Rabbi Dr. Sytner speak, one thing that we all knew was that we needed to invite him back to come and speak to us again. We all wanted to hear more. And we're privileged this evening to be able to hear from him again. It's not quite the circumstances we'd anticipated. And hopefully, Rabbi Dr. Sytner, we hope to invite you back again in person in happier times soon. But in the meantime, we're honored to have you joining us tonight on this broadcast. Just say briefly, for those who don't know, Rabbi Dr. Sytner is a licensed social worker and couples therapist with a private practice in Teaneck. He is the Director of Leadership and Community Development for Yeshiva University's Center for the Jewish Future. He provides trauma intervention for Chai Lifeline. He frequently lectures for Shalom Task Force. And in addition to all of that, he has experience as a pulpit rabbi for 13 years. Joining us this evening, or this afternoon, from where he is in Bergenfield, Rabbi Dr. Sytner.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kenigsberg. What a great pleasure and an honor to be able to join you. It's hard to believe. Just a few months ago, yes, I was right there in the UK, and all seemed well in the world at the time. It was a wonderful experience to be able to meet the rabbinate across the pond. And to just have this wonderful experience and sort of asked me at the time, what are some of my upcoming fears in life? I would have said, well, Passover is just a couple of weeks away. And on top of that, it was a 3-day Yom Tov. Those were the things on my mind that I was nervous about. And then the world changed so quickly, right? Just within a few days of hearing the reading of Megillat Esther. So things started to change. And the world started to change. A little stereotype, a little audio Esther. Are we sounding good? Not always that. Good. Let's see if that will help. Change it. Does that sound any better? Okay. So, all right. So here we go. We got the thumbs up, and you didn't have to hear me sing. So this is it, right? This is the point. The world just suddenly throws you a curveball. I'm about to speak, and there's no audio. The audio is not great. This is the feel of what it means to be able to suddenly face something unexpected. So that was a quick little demonstration. So what happened with us right after work? Hang on, it seems like there's still some audio issues. Let me just do a quick change of my sound system, see if that helps.
Okay, we'll be back very, very shortly with Rabbi Dr. Sytner. We're just having some slight technical issues, but we hope to get those sorted out very soon. I think Rabbi Dr. Sytner started speaking about a couple months ago when we spoke at the conference, talking about the things that we were expecting, talking about trying to plan forward a few months in the future. Thinking about all the things that were coming up, talking about 3-day Yom Tov, Purim, Pesach, all sorts of things, and just how the world has really changed so quickly in an instant. With this whole situation that we find ourselves in.
Okay, I'm back.
And he's back.
How does that sound, Johnny? Are we good? We're good. Much better. Okay. Baruch Hashem. So, case in point, ladies and gentlemen, right? What do they say in Yiddish? Mensch tracht und Gott lacht, right? You make a plan and then God has other plans. And here we are. So I'm here talking about what happens when life throws you a curveball. So yes, a couple of months ago, I was in the UK. Life was grand. And within just a few short weeks, everything changed, right? So what happened in our world, right? So our children's schools were closed. Our shuls were shut down, right? It suddenly became a world where people were holding weddings on driveways, where somebody set Shiva and people would visit them by Zoom. Just an hour ago, my niece made a simcha. She made a bris in her apartment, and dozens of people from all over the world were zooming in. Right? That's such a different world, and so the world as we knew it suddenly changed. And the question we start to look at is, what happens to us emotionally, psychologically, when the world that we know suddenly changes? And so one of the hats that I wear at Yeshiva University and the work that I do with Chai Lifeline is providing crisis response. So one example of that is, you'll remember 2 years ago, there were some very tragic mass shootings in synagogues, one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, one in Poway in California. And so I went out immediately in the aftermath to try to soothe some of the emotional needs of those people that were in crisis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But one of the features that we see in crisis is that when something abruptly just rocks your world, your brain enters a state of trauma. It's what we call fight or flight. Suddenly I get nervous. I become hyper vigilant. So my brain wants to protect me and keep me safe. So the way that we do that is the brain signals really interesting defense mechanisms, coping tools that don't really let us function, but try to keep us safe. So as an example, I can't really fall asleep at night. I can't really think clearly, right? I can't even articulate myself clearly. Why? Because my brain is in this hypervigilant state, elevated, just sort of like scanning, waiting for something dangerous to happen. And so what happens is your basic coping mechanisms are gone. And so what do we do in those situations, right? How do we start to reestablish ourselves as being safe, as being in a place that we could start to live? And that's the goal of providing crisis intervention, to be able to help people regain a sense of equilibrium. And so the challenge that we have today, though, is very unique, right? Because yes, our world was turned upside down. The problem is that number one, we're facing an invisible enemy, right? We don't know when COVID will strike, and you don't know where, and you don't know who's carrying it, and you don't know if you got it, can you get it again? And you don't know if there's going to be a vaccine soon. All of these questions, the more the questions that exist, the more stress and anxiety that a person feels. So this is really stressful. And in fact, there's another interesting contrast between this and a typical type of a crisis. So the early research of crisis intervention goes back to 1942 by doctors Kaplan and Lindemann. And they basically worked with survivors of a very tragic fire, the Coconut Grove nightclub in Massachusetts, where dozens of people tragically perished. And they worked with the survivors. And what they started to find was that those people who got crisis intervention really quickly, as soon close to the event as possible, were recovering much faster than people who maybe received the same crisis intervention a few days or a few weeks later. And we started to understand the following, which is when you're in a state of crisis, right? So your brain, was you're at a nightclub, you're dancing, you're having fun. Suddenly there's a fire. Abruptly, just like that, your world starts to change. And when that happens, so you see the flames, you see the fire, you get out, you survived. But in your mind's eye, you still know that there are flames. Until someone can confirm for you, the fire's been put out. You're safe. Then the brain could say, okay, now I can relax, right? So the person who's 100th in line to receive crisis intervention is much more likely to be in a state of waiting for that calming, soothing, for that feeling of saying, yes, the fire is now completely been extinguished. And so that's going to be the effect of trauma. The longer it waits, the more damage it does. And the sooner we can convince you that the flames are out, the more you could return to normal living. So what about us? Right, where are we? We've made great progress in trying to, as they say, flatten the curve. But unfortunately, we may not quite be out of the woods just yet. So we are still in a position where we're experiencing. In other words, in our mind's eye, can we say that the flames are out? Can we say that the fire has died down and that we can start to resume normal living? Right. So one of the things I can tell you just anecdotally as a marriage therapist, so I'm seeing a huge spike in people's relationship challenges, right? So when a couple is doing great, okay, so they'll handle the challenges. When a couple is doing kind of okay, what's going to happen when they're okay is when they see each other for 3 or 4 hours every night, but then they go to work during the day, right? They can manage it. Suddenly, if they're in quarantine, they're spending weeks or months together 24/7. They're not so okay. In fact, in Wuhan, right, in China, right where this all began, so they're right after the quarantine was lifted, right, because they're a couple of weeks, couple of months behind us in terms of the curve. So what they noticed as soon as the quarantine was lifted was that hundreds of couples were coming flooding into the government divorce office right after the quarantine. They're like, I'm here to file for divorce. And they were like, what is going on here? And in their great wisdom, they said something very interesting. They said, you know what? We suspect that a lot of what's happening is really just COVID related. So why don't you guys go home? Go back to your day jobs. Go get some couples therapy. And if you still want a divorce in a few months, you can come back. And people did that. And so the global impact that we start to see is that there is a huge surge in stress, in anxiety, in depression, where people, rightfully so, are just uneasy. They're on edge. They're not sleeping well. They're not eating well. It's hard to function, and that's the storm, proverbial storm that we're discussing this evening. And not to mention, right? Let's take a moment and recognize those people who've spent months in quarantine, who've been by themselves. What about the elderly? What about singles? What about the infirmed? Right? What about all the people who, when Pesach came, had to have a Pesach Seder by themselves? That's really painful. And that's just emblematic of one element of the overarching challenges that people are facing throughout this crisis. So how do we cope? So one of the hallmarks of the Jewish people is our resilience. Okay, let that settle in for a second. Finding calm amid the storm is really something that's in our DNA, right? In other words, if you look throughout our history, there are many tragic, difficult experiences. And yet we keep persevering. We keep pushing through one after another, and that's our story. And by the way, in your honor this evening, I'm drinking tea out of my mug that I got in Heathrow Airport, my London mug. So I always think about the London communities, the United Synagogue, when I enjoy this tea. L'chaim. So if there's one particular event in our history that I think really captures this idea, it goes back to Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And if you think about the experience, what happened? Hundreds of years of pain, of oppression, of suffering. Right? We're talking about dealing with 3 months, 6 months worth of hardship. Hundreds of years in Mitzrayim. And the real story, though, is that through the pain and the suffering and the oppression, is that if you just hang on long enough, what does the story end with? It's going to be followed by redemption. That's our formula. That's our secret sauce. Yes, we suffer. But then we always find ways to discover meaning in our turbulent times. And I think Viktor Frankl said it best. For those who are familiar with Viktor Frankl, he's the author of Man's Search for Meaning, and actually another book I have on my desk I'm in the middle of reading now, which is Yes to Life, in Spite of Everything. Just an inspirational, prolific thinker and writer. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, and right before the war, he was engaging in some of the top forms of psychotherapy, and then lost his wife, lost his family, lost everything in the concentration camps. And he went on to develop logotherapy, which is this idea of trying to find purpose and meaning in suffering. And he came up with an equation. So let's just picture this equation. D equals S minus M. D equals S minus M. So let's break apart that formula. D is for despair. What is despair? When does a person experience despair? He says it's not from suffering. Suffering alone doesn't cause you despair. It doesn't cause you hopelessness. You know, when you experience hopelessness and despair, it's when you have S minus M. It's when you have suffering, but without the meaning. S is for suffering, M is for meaning. So despair is when you have suffering without meaning. If you have meaning, if you can find purpose in your suffering, then it's not in vain. Then there are lessons and there's growth and there's inspiration that can be drawn from those ashes. And so this evening, I want to invite you to think about, how can we find calm during these turbulent times? How can we find purpose? How can we discover meaning? And again, going back to the idea of the Exodus from Egypt, I think it really can serve as a very powerful platform to process this. You know, there's a mitzvah every single day for a person to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, that we were once slaves in Egypt. That's it. You know, there are not a lot of historical events that a person must remember every single day, right? And in fact, when we say Shema every morning, every night, right at the end of Shema, right, we have that reminder that God took us out of Egypt. So what is it about this daily reminder that we hold on to? Number one, the Almighty is always with us, even in the darkness of Egypt, even in the turbulent seas of Jonah, or the hells of Viktor Frankl's experiences in the Holocaust. Yes, even in difficult times, right? The Almighty says, Imo Anochi Batzara. I'm with you in your suffering. You're not alone. So the first thing to recognize is that while times are difficult, while people are suffering, we're not doing this alone. God is with us. And that's a daily reminder that no matter what we're going through, we're not going through it alone. Secondly, let's keep in mind that the connection that we have to Mitzrayim also is an opportunity for us to transform ourselves. So think about it this way. Were we slaves in Egypt? Yes. And was that our identity? Yes. But is that the narrative that we're going to stick with for the rest of our lives, for eternity, for the destiny of the Jewish people? That yes, we were slaves. So you know what? We're going to continue to stay with a slave mentality. So we remember Egypt every day, but what we also remember is that we took an experience from it of becoming transformed through adversity to go from slavery to royalty. And that's the Jewish experience. To be able to go from Auschwitz in 1945 to only 3 years later in 1948 and declare Israel as the independent Jewish homeland for the first time in thousands of years, that's mind-boggling. How does that happen? Right? That's the Jewish experience. To be able to take our greatest troubles and say, redemption will be born from this. Growth will come from this. D equals S minus M. And so the first lesson of our adversity, number one, is to remember our faith in God. Our faith in God, even in the darkness. You know, if you think about part of the Passover Seder, so we sing this song, Baruch HaMakom, Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu. I'm not going to do the whole thing. But we refer to God as HaMakom, the place. And then later on in Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah, we say it again, Hashem is Makom. Why Makom? Why do we call God the place? Why not just say the Almighty, Hashem? Right? And if you think about it further at a Shiva house, we say HaMakom Yenachem Eschem, that the Makom, the Almighty, the place, should comfort you. When we say prayers for our brethren who are suffering, we say the prayer of Achenu, HaMakom Yirachem, right? So all of these are references to God as Makom. Why? Because specifically in times of hardship, it's when we feel most alone, when we're in the dark, that we feel like we're by ourselves, that we remember Hashem is Makom. Hashem fills all places. There's no such thing as ever truly being alone, because God is occupying the space with us together. And so that's lesson number one. And the second lesson is to remember that even when it's tough, we don't run from it. And that's a difficult thing to say and sometimes a difficult thing to hear, but we confront it because we know that, as Viktor Frankl has pointed out, and as our sages have told us, growth happens in hardship. Our sages have referred to our experience in Egypt as Kor Barzel, right? Which is essentially the process of heating metal so hot where it's red hot, and it removes the impurities. When we experienced the slavery in Egypt, we went through a refining process. We learned there's such a thing as an oppressor, and there's a person who is oppressed. Which one would you choose to be? What does it mean to be able to use your free will to become a better human being, to become a compassionate person, to, as the Torah says, don't oppress others because you were once slaves. You know what it's like to suffer. And so part of the mandate of the Jewish people and our destiny is to think of ourselves as vehicles for embodying compassion, for teaching compassion. And that's what the holiday of Passover is doing. It's not only acknowledging, but we're celebrating. We're able to sing and dance and enjoy festivities over the fact that this transformation happened. So let's go on to the third lesson. We all know that Passover has a lot of symbolism, right? The magic number is 4 sons, 4 questions, 4 cups. So if the magic number is 4, think about this. Why, when we open the Seder, the first thing, before we even sing Kadesh or Chatz, the first thing we do is we put 3 matzahs on the table. Wait, why 3? Why not put 4? That would fit the whole bill for the evening. 3 is a lesson in inclusion. That it's telling us, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, that the Jews have to be mindful of the diverse tapestry of who we are, of what it means to embrace the fullness of the Jewish people. In other words, in times of hardship, we can't forget about the other. There's no such thing as the other. We have to be mindful of each person. We have a responsibility to feel that sense of community. So we begin the Seder with this notion of, when we're going through hardship, guess what? We're in this together. And so that's going to be the first opening lesson of the Seder, right? To remember that nobody should fall through the cracks. As the Seder begins with the words Halach Ma'anya and saying, anyone that's hungry, come join us. It's Jewish responsibility, social responsibility. And actually, it's something fascinating from my teacher, my Rebbe, Rabbi Dr. J.J. Schachter, who quoted from the 18th century, the Chok Yaakov, who says that there's a custom in minhag at the Passover Seder to actually have 4 matzahs. So if we have Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, what is the 4th matzah, right? Why would you have 4? And he explains that the 4th matzah is called the matzah of Safek, the matzah of doubt, right? What does that mean? What doubt? Because we know you're supposed to have 3 whole matzahs. And what happens if, as these fragile little crackers can sometimes do, what happens if one breaks? That can happen. So what he says is, have a 4th matzah as a backup. It's just in case. But the question really is, if you're going to have a 4th matzah, why not just keep it in the kitchen, right? And if you need it, you'll pull it out of the box and you'll use it. Why is the 4th matzah, according to this custom, even brought to the table if you're not really intending to use it? And Rabbi Schachter explains so beautifully that the idea of safek, of living in a world where there is doubt, can come in 2 forms. So number 1, sometimes, yes, that matzah is kept off to the side. Sometimes doubt is in the background. Sometimes life's uncertainties are really distant to us. And we go through life and everything is great. And then there are other times, right? Times of hardship, times of difficulty, right? Times where the uncertainty is at the table, right? Where it's front and center. And that's part of the challenge that we really struggle with when we recognize that we are living in times today where that doubt is very much a part of how we're living. Uncertainty about the future, right? And people who had a Pesach Seder by themselves, or people find themselves struggling with employment, with finances, with difficult emotions, right? People who are having a Zoom Shiva or want to say Kaddish over the last few months and couldn't, right? So this brings us to the 4th lesson. And the 4th lesson is that it's okay to not always be okay. And I know that in our community, we always try to be our best and we want to give off a good impression and make a Kiddush Hashem and make sure the world sees the best in us. Make sure that for the sake of, finding the best quality suitors for our children to marry, right? For Shidduchim, we want to put on the best appearances for everybody. But you know what? It's also okay to not always be okay. It's okay for safek, for uncertainty, for that fragility, the same way that the matzah can crack. It's okay for that to be a part of our lives from time to time, and not to really fight it, but to just accept that that's part of who we are. Now, throughout our history, one of the popular responses that we find that people react to when there's hardship is they say, this is it. this must be Mashiach. The Messiah is finally here. And someone actually called me recently and he asked me the question. He says, Rabbi, can I ask you, is COVID-19 a sign that Mashiach is here? And I clarified, are you asking me as a rabbi or as a therapist? Because those might give you two different answers. And he went on to explain that, he got a WhatsApp, a message with a whole gematria and the numerical values of different COVID-related things added up to somehow Mashiach is coming. Okay, great. But I gave him my short answer, which is I'm not a Navi. I'm not a prophet. I can't predict things like that. And, the Lord hasn't spoken to me yet today and shared with me his master plan. So, right, what do I know? But there is a Gemara in Yevamos 63a that says, Ein Peranius ba la'olam, ela b'shvil Yisrael, which means that hardships don't befall the world unless there's some message in it for the Jewish people. There's a relevance for the Jewish people. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, can we listen to that call? In other words, anyone that claims to know that they think they know the reason why this is all happening, they probably don't, right? Again, unless they are a certified, verified prophet. But maybe it's just a message that Hashem is trying to get our attention, the same way a parent calls out to their child. Hashem is calling to us, right? There is a message, right? There are opportunities here for us to take a difficult time and try to transform ourselves. So to be able to focus more on our families, the value of what family means, of our prayers for those times that we couldn't go to shul, right? For those people even today who maybe many of the shuls have opened, but they're immunocompromised and they're afraid to go out and they haven't heard laning and they haven't been able to participate in minyan or kaddish. But for them, that experience of davening by themselves, of worshiping and communing with God alone, how do we transform that into something more meaningful? So there is a message. And I think sometimes the biggest tragedy is when we go through a tragedy, but we resume life as normal, as if nothing happened, right? And that's really something to think about. Because if we can look at that formula for finding meaning and purpose, then the entire tragedy takes on a whole different life. There's a Gemara in Shabbos 31a that tells us that when a person leaves this world, we go up to the next world and the Almighty is going to ask us a series of 6 questions. Some of those questions include Nasasa v'nasata b'emuna. Did you conduct your business dealings faithfully? God's going to ask Asakta b'pirya v'rivya. Did you attempt to procreate? Kavata itim l'Torah. Did you have a set time daily to study Torah? And Tzipisa liYoshua. Did you long for redemption? Right? In other words, when that time comes and Mashiach arrives, are you going? Right? Now that sounds like a silly question. Like if Mashiach was here, of course, well, I hear the shofar and the call is here and the third temple is going to be rebuilt. Great, let's pick up and go. Why wouldn't I go? Well, it's not that simple. For a moment, look back at our track record. When the Jewish people were, traversing the desert and we wanted to go into the promised land, we have the story of the Meraglim, the 12 spies. Right? So God does all these miracles, gets us out of Egypt, splits the sea, provides manna in the desert. And suddenly when we're about to go, they're like, well, we, like a shul board. They say, well, we need to have a committee and we're going to think about it and we'll get a report and then we'll decide and then we'll vote. This should have just been go. This is it. This is the promise to Abraham of coming to our promised land. Like, let's do it. But we weren't ready. And instead we were in the desert and we're twiddling our thumbs and we say, Zacharnu es hadaga asher nachalnu mitzrayim chinam. We remember the good old days of Egypt. Oh, you remember those days where we got, free food and cucumbers and melons and fish. Oh, it was a whole kiddush, a smorgasbord. It was great. And so on the one hand, yes, we say we're always eager to greet Mashiach and we want that redemption. But gosh, I don't know. If Mashiach came right now, would we be willing to just quickly jump and run from all of our physical earthly possessions and just say, I'm going, that's where I belong? I remember when I was a kid, there was a Jewish song in 1986 that was produced by someone named Rocky Zweig, and the album is called Legacy, and has a really cute song called Borough Park in 1994. So remember, this is in 1986, and it was predicting the future. And it was saying how everything in Borough Park, right, really strong enclave of Hasidic, strong Orthodox life, and it's getting fancier, and people are getting fancier homes. And in the song, he jokes that instead of streetlights, They're going to put in chandeliers, and the streets are going to be paved with gold, and the sidewalks will be carpeted. And he goes through all of this shtick, and then at the end of the song, he has a line that sends shivers up my spine. He says, life here is so good that when Mashiach's shofar is blowing, are we going to tell him we're not going? Because we found our promised land. Right? So thank God we have established ourselves in the diaspora in miraculous, incredible ways. At the same time, part of what we have to hold on to is the fact that there is a future for us that is great. And this seems to fit the narrative of our past, because what we really need is hope. And that's the fifth lesson for us to hold on to this evening, that hope is a critical ingredient for us to be able to weather the storm. And there's research on this which deals with how people respond when they have hope, right? If you look at people who have hope versus people that don't. So those who have hope will have healthier levels of physical, of psychological well-being. In fact, there was one research study that I saw that compared students with high levels of hope compared to those with low levels. And they found that the higher levels of hope had higher GPA scores. They had higher rates of graduation, right? But this wasn't about intellectual ability. It was about hope. There was another study that looked at law school students and their overall grade performance. So researchers basically made an assumption. If you did really well on the LSATs are the entrance exams to get into law school. If you did really well, you'll probably do better in law school. And yet, they didn't find that to be the case. But what they did find statistically significant was a correlation between your grades in law school and those who maintained a positive attitude of hope. So for those people who can hold on to hope in the way that we talk about to await for Mashiach every single day, that is a sense of hope. To never despair, to never lose that sense of meaning, of purpose, of where we're going, right? But to be able to look to our future. And I want to look at another aspect of this through the lens of the Exodus, because after the plagues and the Exodus and the splitting of the sea, the Torah describes something interesting, right? So we're through it all and we're in the desert. And right after the Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, the pasuk says, "Vatikach Miriam Hanaviyah," and Miriam the prophetess takes Achos Aharon es hatov biada. She takes the tambourines in her hands right after the splitting of the sea, and she starts leading everyone in music and singing and dancing, and the women were celebrating, and it was this great, incredible celebration. So 2 questions for you. Torah doesn't use any extra words. Number 1, why does the Torah refer to Miriam as Miriam the prophetess? And number 2, you want to tell me where in the middle of the desert she got tambourines? Like, you don't just run into the local store and pick them up. So part of what we want to be able to recognize here is that to answer both of these questions, you have to realize she was a woman of vision. The Torah says she was a prophetess because think about the fact that she looked to the future and had hope. Everyone else leaving Mitzrayim, what did they take? They took matzah, they took gold and silver, they even took weapons. We were leaving Egypt in a frenzy, right? Why do you need weapons, right? Why are you taking food? Why are you taking gold? Because the future is unknown and we're scared. Miriam, open up her suitcase. What does she take? She says, hey guys, where do we keep the instruments? They're going, instruments? What do you need instruments for? We're going into the desert. She's like, oh, there's going to be a big celebration. That's what it means to be a Neviah, to be a prophetess, to have vision, to look to the future and say there is optimism even in frightening times. Things will get better. That's what it means, to long for the redemption and say, like the Chavetz Chaim used to have a suitcase that was packed, that he said, I'm waiting for Mashiach. As soon as the time comes, I'm going to grab my go bag and head to Eretz Yisrael. And so that's the inspiration we need today. And to hold on to that 5th lesson, the vision of hope, the hope that carries us to the future. So yes, we may suffer now, but we have to remember things will improve. And for us, that's not just a personal declaration, but it's a national statement. In other words, I myself might suffer, but nationally, we are going to hold on to something bigger than me. Right? Shlomo Carlebach illustrates this with a very powerful story. He tells of a Seder on he calls it the last Seder, right before the war, where the writing was on the wall and the Nazis were going door to door and collecting people. And he said there was one Seder where there's a family having get up to Manishtana, and they have a son, Maishla. And Michael turns to his father and he asks the 4 questions. And then right after the 4 questions, he asks a 5th. And he says, Tati, I have a 5th question. And the father says, okay, son, what's the 5th question? And he says, Tati, will we be here next year for the Seder? And the father was very moved by the child's honesty. And he answered, he said, Maishala, I don't know if you will be here. I don't know if I will be here. But what I can tell you is there will be another Maishala. There will be another Seder. And the Jewish people will continue to go on as strong as ever. That's what it means to hold on to national hope. Something that's bigger than me as an individual. And so I don't know what the future will hold, but I know that I have the ability to be able to hold on to that vision, just like Miriam said, let's look to the future, right? So that's what we want to embrace, right? That things may not be okay, but I can be okay with that because they will once again be okay, right? And that hope that we hold on to is what calms the waves of anxiety that so many of us feel. And I'll just speak to this for a minute, this idea of anxiety, of stress. These are very normal feelings, and it's important that we validate them. It's important to validate that parents are struggling with children when kids are home, and that really strains the dynamic of the home. The marriages are suffering, that people individually are having a tough time. Abraham Maslow gives us a very important concept, what he calls the hierarchy of needs. And you may have seen that pyramid illustrating the different levels of what a person needs, starting from the ground up. In other words, he says that you can't focus on an inspirational drasha if you haven't eaten in 2 days. You can't form loving relationships if your life is in danger. What we need to have is stability. You have to start off, you have to have food and shelter and safety. And once you have that sense of stability, then you can start moving toward a place of friendship, of focusing on spirituality, right? On esteem, on self-actualization. But you have to first fulfill those core needs. Otherwise, it impacts everything else. And you start to feel anxiety because life feels a little bit out of whack. So it can be helpful during these times to just give yourself the permission to acknowledge your emotions, to identify the source of anxiety. So if you're feeling, let's say you're reacting, screaming at your kids and just like, wow, where's this coming from? I'm short with my boss. I'm avoiding my spouse. Whatever is happening, that's not really like me. What is going on? Where is that coming from? And start to say, am I feeling a little anxious? Maybe that's what it is. And then to dig deeper, why am I anxious? Am I anxious about the virus? Am I anxious about my job and my income? Am I anxious about taking care of my kids when there's no school or camp? Am I anxious about, a shortage of toilet paper? What is it that I'm nervous about? So the first thing to do is just notice your emotions, honor them. Don't fight them. Breathe into them. In through the nose, hold it for 3 seconds, and exhale. Feel the chair beneath you. Feel the floor underneath you. Feel grounded. In other words, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. And so, Maslow would say you'll feel anxious, and that's normal. But right now in this moment, as you're breathing and feeling your breath, it's a reminder that you're feeling okay, that we're going to get through today, that we have hope, as Miriam taught us, to think about the future. But right now, that's where it starts. Another point is that it's imperative to disconnect from media and from social media, which research has found to be very, very detrimental as a source of secondary trauma. So even for people who didn't experience a catastrophe, if they watch it on social media, or on the news, they're going to experience what's called vicarious or secondary trauma and start to feel some of those things. So it's really important to say, if I'm feeling a little triggered, I think it's best if I disconnect. Let me give myself a little bit of that space and not really tap into those elements which are going to trigger me. And I want to conclude with one final idea, which is this idea of coming together, of caring for each other as a community. When we're facing hardship, the greatest thing we could do is support each other. The previous Mir Rosh Yeshiva was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zechrono Livracha. And in his later years, he wasn't a well man, and he had a hard time speaking. And he would still learn all day. He would give lectures, give shir, and people would come to him for blessings. And about 10, 12 years ago, there were a group of Jewish businessmen from America who came to do a business entrepreneurial tour of Israel. And someone said, guys, you should really go see this saintly rabbi, Rabbi Finkel. So one of the members of the group, who happened to be the CEO of Starbucks, a Jew by the name of Howard Schultz, said, Okay, sounds good. I'd like to meet a saintly rabbi. So the group goes to the yeshiva and they meet with the rabbi, and they're sitting around this conference table, and Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel walks in, and they didn't know that he was suffering from Parkinson's, that he was frail, and it was hard for him to speak. So he looks around the room, and in a whisper, he asks them a question. And he says, who here can tell me what was the lesson of the Holocaust? That's a big question, right? No one knew what to say. So everyone kind of just sits back. And then the rabbi called on one of the gentlemen around the table. And the person said, the lesson is never forget. And the rabbi said, no. Okay. And so he panned the room again. And here you have these titans of industry worth tens of billions. And they're schwitzing in front of this frail rabbi. And he calls on someone else. And the person says, we should never be bystanders again. And again, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel said, no, you just don't get it. He said, the lesson of the Holocaust is this. In the Holocaust, people were transported by cattle car for 10, 12 hours, sometimes 30 hours, no food, no drink, no bathrooms. And when they arrived at the camps and they were divided up, those that were lucky enough to not be sent immediately to their deaths, so they had to go to the barracks. And it was a freezing, cold winter night. And in their cruelty, the Nazis gave one blanket to every 6 people. So the 6th person who received the blanket had a decision to make. Do I keep that blanket for myself, or do I share it with others? And Rav Finkel said, you wonder what the greatest lesson of the Holocaust was? It was during this defining moment that we learned the power of the human spirit. Because even in our greatest darkness, what did we do? We pushed the blanket over to share it to 5 other people. And with that, Rav Finkel stood up and he said to them, each and every one of you were blessed in your life to have more than the next person. And the question is, will you keep it for yourself, or will you make a difference? Will you make a difference in the lives of other people by sharing your blanket with 5 others? And my friends, ladies and gentlemen, no matter how tumultuous the world is, it's on us to realize that things could be dark, but there's also a spark of light, and that spark is in the blessings that we have and the gratitude. The word Jew comes from the word Yehudi. It means todah. That's the root word of it. Thank you, gratitude. How can we take a few moments every day and just close our eyes and think about the blessings that we have, even though things can be stressful, even though things are tough? Research has found time and time again that the greatest way to get through hardships is by being able to embrace social support. And for some people, it's very easy. And for others, it's a little more difficult. So perhaps the greatest thing that we could all do in a practical way during these difficult times is to make sure that we can reach out to somebody else, to check on those people who we know that we like, that we're friends, that are popular, but also those people who are less popular, those people who are shut, and those people who are sometimes forgotten about and overlooked, to push our blanket over and show those people, don't be cold, right? I'm here for you. You're not alone. You can send a text message to someone, I'm thinking about you, or wishing you a good Shabbos. And those small little deeds, that's what it means to embrace the destiny of the Jewish people. To those acts that please God, we should be able to do, that should, in times of darkness, bring the light that we need to usher in the redemption and bring peace and healing for all of the world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Rabbi Dr. Sytner. That was wow. Really, really powerful, empowering presentation. I think you've given us both in terms of the perspective to have, as well as some really great practical advice how to get through these difficult times. Now open up. There's a couple of questions that have come in privately. If people have right now, we have time for a couple of questions as well. If people want to put in the comments on the side, we'll try and add those in. If I can just ask you one or two that have come through to me so far. I think you spoke about really in terms of using Yetziat Mitzrayim, going out of Egypt, as a paradigm for how to get through difficult times. But for me personally, there was a real eye opener. You mentioned how we remember it every day in terms of we remember the redemption, but you stressed as well how we remember going through the hardships and dealing with those times. And one of the lessons you mentioned is the fact that whatever difficulty we're going through, we're not in it alone. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there with us. And the question here is in this situation, we've seen something unique, I think almost unprecedented. The fact that certainly when this began, all of our shuls were closed. We were kicked out of the house of Hashem, so to speak. And now the situation is different. Some places have opened up, and some places are thinking about it. But we had a good few weeks, where just about across the entire Jewish world, we couldn't come together for tefillah b'tzibur. We couldn't come into our shuls, and that's what has given us so much comfort in so many of these situations. The one who's with us seemed to be pushing us away. And how would you answer? How would you say to somebody who says, how can we say that Hakadosh Baruch Hu is with us through all of it when he seems to be pushing us away?
Right. It's a great question. I appreciate it. My first answer is I don't speak on behalf of the Almighty. Certainly God can find better spokespeople than me. So I'm not going to pretend that I know what God's master plan is. That being said, all I can do is look at not the why, because it's hard for us to speak to the why, but the what. Right. So from a practical perspective, what has changed? And what I think I can just share from my own home, what it's been like on an Erev Shabbos to just daven with my children and to be able to sing Kabbalat Shabbat together. I feel, so often that my feet are just not touching the ground, that life is just so busy, so overwhelming, digital overload, relationships are suffering, everyone's just go, 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 go. And, even though we have Shabbos to ground us, it's like, 20 minutes before Shabbos, so you jump in the shower and then you come out, you're running to shul and you get there, a few minutes late. It's just, I felt disconnected from the spirit of what we're supposed to be doing. And through this process, I think it gave me a sense of what does it mean for me to connect to God personally rather than somebody else do it for me. So in other words, if I get in a car and somebody else is driving, I can sit in the back seat and go along for the ride. That's what it's like when you quote unquote chapa mincha, right? You run into shul to grab mincha because you just got to get it over with, and it's a checkbox because it's an obligation. So we'll just do it fast and get it over with. Am I really investing in it? Somebody else is driving. But when I have to be the one to drive, and it takes a lot of effort to bring myself in my own home, it was a different experience these last few months. And I think a lot of people had that experience of being more deliberate. There were times where I found it hard to focus and to concentrate, to have kavanah. And I actually logged into a couple of different shuls around the world to join them for their Zoom. It wasn't a minyan, but their Zoom davening, just to be amongst other people, because some days I needed that. And I think that's the bracha that Hashem gave us, this challenge during times where the technology was there. Even if this happened 10 years ago, we could have finagled some of the technology, but it just wouldn't have been the same. Certainly 20 or 30 years ago. So there is a lot of bracha of Hashem saying, all right, kid, let me challenge you here. What happens if I take away the shul? Right. So the question is the what. What are we going to do differently as a result of any challenge that we find ourselves facing?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Just another question that's come through here. Maybe we'll end off with this. I guess we're sort of entering a new stage now. Just until now, we've had the lockdown. We mentioned schools being closed. Everybody, and at the beginning that was very difficult. Throughout, it was challenging. But as the weeks go by, people sort of get used to that. Get used to that sort of situation, or the difficulties it poses. And we're now maybe moving back towards, releasing the lockdown restrictions, going back to normal. Everybody's talking about the old normal and the new normal, and or the normal until we get back to the old normal, and that obviously poses different challenges. Maybe we're less in the storm, so to speak, but maybe expected to be back to normal. But of course, there are still anxieties and stresses and maybe new ones that come through. So what practical advice would you give just to deal with the constant change and maybe the new phase that we're going into?
It's a great question. I think we're all wrestling with that question right now. The first thing I want to point out is that the reality is different based on your zip code. Okay, so I speak to rabbis all around the world, and I spoke to one rabbi just yesterday who lives less than 50 miles from where I am. but he's in a different state, a different city, a different area, and as a result, the governing rules from his state are different than mine, right? So I'm in New Jersey. New York is only a few minutes away. Connecticut is this way. Depending on where you are, everything will change. Certainly, right? If you're in one part of England, another part of England, if you're in Israel. So here we are having this beautiful global conversation, but we should be sensitive to not lump everybody together. One person might be living in more of a hotspot. Another person might be more immunocompromised and more vulnerable. And I think everybody needs to confront themselves and say, what's my capacity? Like, what am I able to do? Am I able to, daven in a backyard minyan, if that's what my rabbi or community are suggesting? Am I able to go to shul if the shul's opening up? It shouldn't be from a place of obligation. I think one of the challenges that, the rabbis are definitely going to be facing is, people were complaining about, 3-hour davenings 6 months ago, right? And now when a person has been davening at home for the last few months and you can do the whole davening in an hour and a half if you want to take it slow, suddenly when the shuls open up and it's back to 3 hours, it's going to be really difficult, right? And I think we just need to be agile and give ourselves permission to struggle a little bit, to just be not so perfect, to say this is going to be hard and it's going to be an adjustment, and any adjustment, right? The first time you go away to college, start a new job, first learn to drive, all of those are new experiences that the brain has to adapt to. It's not just going to happen because you show up. It's not going to be easy. And that's been a collective Jewish experience throughout history, is that we go to a new land, right? So one day we're living in Israel, and the next day we're in Spain, and another time we're in, I don't know, pick a land, right? The whole world, right? We just keep going. And we learn new languages, and we learn to adapt, and we learn to set up communities and shuls and mikvaot and eruvin and yeshivas, and we do it. So the only I can say is to be honest with yourself about what your capacity is. When you notice it's hard, just notice it. Just honor that and say it's going to get easier with a little bit of experience, rather than saying, well, this is too hard and therefore I'm not going to do it. Okay, kind of lean into it. Be okay with your humanity, with being vulnerable, because that's the way the Almighty made us. And if God didn't want us to feel that way, He would have made us angels, right? And so we are not angels. We're human. We are fallible. We make mistakes. We're supposed to learn from those mistakes, and hopefully through this experience, we'll find new parts of ourselves that we wouldn't have otherwise discovered.
Thank you. I think we'll end it there on that positive note. Really, as I said before, it's been inspiring, it's been empowering, and you've given us all a lot to think about, a lot of practical tools to take with us. And as I said at the beginning, we look forward to hosting you again in person once all the social distancing is over.
Absolutely, with pleasure. Thank you so much for arranging this, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking the time this evening to join us. And I very much do look forward to joining you in person soon.